G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. As promised, with episode 14 in my partial book reading series of One Crowded Hour, biography of Neil Davis, combat cameraman, written by Tim Bowden. Here with the second part of chapter 15, Gooks, Dinks and Slopes. We take up with Neil Davis explaining My Lai, Lieutenant Calley's massacre, from his point of view. Davis was not surprised when the My Lai Massacre was exposed and the world suddenly had endless details about Lieutenant Calley's gunning down of unarmed, unprotected women and children. Letter to Aunt Lillian, 5 December 1969, Orange Grove Road, Singapore. I'm afraid the massacre story has almost completely destroyed the credibility of the Americans. In the past, all I could do was to suggest that it wasn't only the communists who perpetrated atrocities. But if I ever spoke too strongly, especially in Australia, I always came under suspicion of being a communist myself. Well, war itself is an atrocity, and it is rarely just one side that is totally to blame. However, I feel sorry for the Americans because this has done them more harm than any peace demonstration back home could possibly do. They will never recover from it. It is interesting to observe that the Vietnamese people themselves understand all this and have more or less ignored the incident. They are aware that these things happen in war and know that they always have. They are rather amazed to think that other people throughout the world haven't understood about that before now. Napalm was a horrible weapon of war. Dropped in canisters from aircraft or helicopters, it spewed out jellied petroleum in obscene explosions of orange fire and jet black smoke. It sticks to your skin and burns straight through to the bone, excruciatingly painful and almost always fatal. At the same time, napalm consumes all the available oxygen in the surrounding air. So if it is dropped on top of bunkers which may well be very well protected from the initial blast of all the jellied petroleum, the people below ground suffocate. One of the most devastating sights I saw was after a napalm bombing raid when American advisors went into the area with South Vietnamese troops. There were a number of survivors and a little old peasant woman came out with what I thought was the remains of a baby in her arms. She walked right up to one of the American officers without saying a word, but deep hatred in her eyes, and threw a bundle at his feet. It wasn't a baby, but the grotesquely burned carcass of her little pet dog, which was all she had left. Davis had strict rules about his own personal conduct when filming the ugly face of war. Always the impartial observer, he determined to keep his cameras rolling. There's almost no situation in which I'd stop filming to do something, because I think a film record of a given situation is ultimately more effective and has greater impact. In the end, it helps more people than if I put down my camera to lend a hand. I did stop filming once in Cambodia to help drag wounded soldiers behind a tree for safety and was quite badly wounded myself. Had I kept filming, I might not have been injured. Some unscrupulous cameramen encourage soldiers to mistreat or even shoot prisoners for their cameras in tense and difficult situations. Once, after a savage action in the Vietnamese highlands, Davis came upon some South Vietnamese who had custody of 3 North Vietnamese regular troops just captured. Seeing his camera, they cheerfully offered to shoot their prisoners. The film would have led television news bulletins all over the world. Davis just smiled and slowly put his camera down on the ground. They were probably shot later, but not because of any action of mine. But on some occasions, Davis used his camera to alter the course of events. In 1970, he was with South Vietnamese troops inside Cambodia. There was a wounded civilian, a man. One of the soldiers went down on his knee to shoot him, and I got behind him with my camera to film, thinking that the very act of filming would stop him, and it did. He hesitated. I thought he might shoot me, actually, but he stopped and did not kill the man. Neil Davis guarded his impartiality jealously. He always said his sympathies were with the Vietnamese people, whether they were Northerners, Southerners, communists or non-communists. Sometimes in discussions I'd find myself arguing for the South Vietnamese side, and at other times for the Viet Cong's stated position. Nothing is black or white. On leave in Australia in 1972, Davis threatened to take legal action against a television station and newspaper that had published a story saying that in action he would put down his camera and fight communism with an M16. He not only regarded this as professionally damaging, but potentially lethal if he were captured by the communists in Vietnam or Cambodia. Although Vietnam has been called the first television war, its horror was not at first apparent on the world's television screens. There were a number of reasons for this. In the mid-1960s, colour television was relatively new to the United States, and it was not introduced to Australia until a few months before the end of the war. Blood loses its impact in black and white, and there was also a policy, bracket, not absolutely enforced, close bracket, that American dead and wounded should not be shown on the screen. The restrictions were laid down by the American government, and the television networks imposed self-censorship by greatly restricting the footage of American casualties. They didn't restrict films showing Vietnamese casualties. I agreed with this to a certain extent, because it wasn't a good thing to have the wives and parents of Americans seeing their men dead on the screen. It could be the first they knew about them being involved in an action. However, I did object in overall terms that the American public was denied the right, and it is a right, to see the worst aspect of the war, that large numbers of Americans were being killed and wounded every day. If more of that had been shown, the full horror of the Vietnam War would have been brought home to the American public much sooner. One way this censorship could have been overcome, Davis argued, was for the film to be held up for several days, until the relatives of the dead and wounded Americans had been informed, and then the footage screened. It was a sad thing for those relatives, but a sadder thing that more and more American soldiers were killed in a war which they should never have been involved in the first place. Americans are very conservative in many ways. Many things will not be shown on American television that will be screened in England, Japan or France. But the Americans are much more like the Australians in this sense, very conservative, particularly when their own people are concerned. There wasn't as much blood shown on American television as on Japanese, British or European. Letter to Aunt Lillian, 27 December 1968, Continental Palace Hotel, Saigon. The Americans have not been pleased with me for some years, mainly because my films are now shown in many countries throughout the world, and they have not always been flattering to the Americans. It's just as simple as that, Auntie. The Americans are quite fascist in some ways and very frightening. Despite frigid relations with American military authorities in Saigon, Davis continued to be offered lucrative jobs with American television networks. The disadvantages from his point of view were that he would be a cameraman working with a reporter and subject not only to the editorial direction of the reporter, but to the prevailing editorial policy on the war at head office, invariably American-oriented. He valued his independence with Viz News, selecting, shooting and scripting his own assignments. He was also aware his footage was distributed to more than 100 countries, some in the communist bloc. His own attitude to his work was uncompromising. He believed it was the journalist's and cameraman's job to bring truth to people. It was the primary professional obligation. His scripting and shot lists were always meticulous, and he was profoundly irritated when the editing and re-scripting of his material were less than adequate. I was confident that Viz News wouldn't butcher my films, but no cameraman or correspondent is ever completely satisfied with the way someone else handles his stories. In overall terms, I was happy I worked for Viz News and not for an individual television organisation or network. What Australian viewers saw of the Vietnam War on their television screens and Davis estimated that about 50% of the film coming in would have been his Viz News coverage, was governed by a rather arbitrary system of censorship. In order for news film to be allowed to come in quickly without going through the usual formalities of customs and a censorship board, the news editors of each of the television networks and the Australian Broadcasting Commission were designated as official censors. It was Davis's view that censorship was applied more rigidly under this scheme than if the film had been reviewed by the Commonwealth Censorship Board. Jack Gully, the ABC's newly appointed Director of Television News in 1967, remembers his incredulity when called into the office of the Controller of News and told, "Forget about objectivity. We are at war." Davis believed his Vietnam footage was cut much more drastically in Australia than anywhere else in the world. You'd think it was a war without violence, that it was all sweetness and light. Just our Australian boys patrolling and keeping the dreaded communists in check. The hierarchy of the ABC's news department believed that news programs were a family affair, and they didn't want the wife and kids watching blood and guts over 7 o'clock dinner, even in black and white. Therefore, Australian viewers were deprived of the right to see exactly what was happening in Vietnam, and many other parts of the world, for that matter. Some of the censorship was crude. In 1966, ABC correspondent Tony Ferguson and an ABC film crew managed to get to Cambodia, then closed to the Western media. Ferguson was being driven along a Phnom Penh street by an Australian embassy diplomat when he did a double take. Australian journalist Wilfred Burchett was walking down the street. At the time, Burchett was persona non grata with the Australian government, as he had reported the Korean and Vietnam wars from the communist side, often travelling in communist countries closed to other Western journalists and denied a passport to return to his native land. Burchett was hated, admired, and he had extraordinary information. Ferguson knew that Burchett had been in South Vietnam with the Viet Cong, hiding in their tunnel complexes while being strafed and bombed by Americans and South Vietnamese firepower. An exclusive interview with this enigmatic man would be of great interest in Australia. He asked his diplomatic chauffeur to stop the car. Burchett agreed to an interview and they made an appointment for the next day. The interview went well, and a delighted Ferguson cabled the ABC in Sydney that his Burchett footage had been dispatched and gave the usual flight and waybill details. Meanwhile in Sydney, all hell broke loose. Burchett was regarded by many in Australia as a traitor, a view shared by the ABC's Controller of News. He ordered the Burchett film to be destroyed on arrival. It never even made the processing lab. During home leave in 1967, Davis was interviewed on ABC television in Melbourne about the way the Vietnam War footage was being censored in Australia. And that brings us close to the upload limit for episode 14 of One Crowded Hour, Tim Bowden's biography of Neil Davis, combat cameraman. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao. Back soon to conclude the chapter.